No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge, the podcast where I bring you the biggest names from the worlds of media, politics, and law. We dive into unfiltered, unapologetic, and insightful conversations. I speak my mind and I encourage my guests to do the same. No topic is off limits, and we dive into the issues that shape our world. Today we have a very special guest joining us who I've known for a very long time, someone who has truly made his mark across politics, media, and business. I'm thrilled to welcome Brian Goldsmith on the show. Brian is a political analyst and media executive, a podcast host in the past himself. He's worked alongside some of the biggest names in news, including Katie Couric, and has an impressive resume that spans from producing top-tier journalism to advising high-level political figures. Previously, Brian served in a variety of roles at CBS News, including as political producer at the Evening News. While at CBS, he won a DuPont Award for his team's coverage of the 2008 presidential campaign and was nominated for an Emmy. Earlier in his career, he was an assistant producer for Jeff Greenfield at CNN, an aide to House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt, and a project manager at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. Whether he's breaking down complex issues or shedding light on the media landscape, Brian always brings sharp insights and a unique perspective to the conversation. We're thrilled to have him here today, especially in a week where so much is going on in politics. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Susan, as always, thank you so much for having me. And I was trying to think of those various activities you mentioned, how many you were responsible for. 70%, 80%. I mean, the thing that your listeners ought to know about you is not only are you a brilliant and path-breaking political operative and law professor, but you're probably the single most generous person I've ever met. And so much of what I've accomplished in life is because of Susan's suggestions, advice, introductions. She's been kind of a fairy godmother to me since I was a kid. So I'm glad this at least gives me the opportunity to say thank you again to—
Well, you're so sweet. I've never been prouder of anybody in my life than I am of Brian, to watch him grow up and grow into a role as a respected political commentator, business executive, anything he can do. So, Brian, thank you for those kind words. But tell me, what's been going on? I've been dealing with some personal issues this last week. What's been going on in the world of politics? It looks like it's going nuts.
Well, I hate to sound flip, but, somebody tried to kill Trump again. And, that's been obviously a very big thing. And it's led to some immediate conversations about strengthening the Secret Service, and to some broader conversations about just the state of our politics, the level of our discourse, and frankly how dangerous this contest has gotten, and how whipped up a few people, particularly on the far right, have been. I don't know where this guy was ideologically. I don't think it really matters. He was a Vivek supporter. He was also a Bernie supporter. But we do have to—
He supported both of them?
He did, yeah. We have to find some way to turn down the temperature on our politics. I mean, my view is that step one in that is excising Donald Trump from our politics, but that's probably a post-election conversation.
But really hasn't, I hate to say this, but hasn't Trump been blaming Democrats for ginning this up when, in my book at least, he's the one who talks about bloodbaths?
Of course, no major party presidential nominee has used rhetoric as charged and as dangerous as Donald Trump's in our history. You have to go to George Wallace, and I'm not even sure he crossed as many lines as Donald Trump has over the years. So this is not normal, even though we've been living with this for 9+ years now. And, I think a lot of leadership is about bringing out either the best or the worst in other people. Pete Buttigieg, for whom I proudly worked, likes to say that, in a lot of people, there is bad and there is good. And the role of leaders is to try to bring out the good and try to bring out the best in the country. And Trump has done precisely the opposite.
But it works, Brian. That's the thing that it's so stunning to me. It's, I see the same jokes on Facebook that you probably see about, you're giving a choice between chicken and a pile of, broken ice and broken glass, and the person asks, how's the chicken cooked? I mean, this is an election in which one candidate has shown himself to be a dangerous liar, and yet he has command of 48% of the electorate, and it's too close to call. How do you account for that?
Well, there are a lot of explanations. One is the economic condition of, a lot of people in the country. Nearly half the country can't afford an unexpected $400 emergency expense. Inflation is a problem that is uniquely damaging and corrosive in politics. Unemployment, as the old saying goes, affects the unemployed. Inflation affects everyone because, even a lot of wealthy people I know are complaining about how much more expensive everything is. And it's hard not to blame the president in power, the party in power. So the economy is really what has given Trump the opening for a comeback. But, how has Trump been able to survive for so long, be so kind of durable in our politics? I keep going back to, a brilliant book written by a friend of mine. You may know her too, Lynn Vavreck at UCLA, wrote, I think, the definitive work on 2016 called Identity Crisis, in which she shows pretty conclusively that what Trump really did was he made identity-inflected issues around race, immigration, crime, et cetera. He brought them to the center of our politics. And if that's what you're fighting about, it's a very powerful draw for a number of people who might be more attracted to Democratic positions on economic issues. But if the choice is going to be about immigration, crime, the border, race, identity, they're going to side with Trump. And as you know, Susan, so well, in politics, it's not just the positions you take, it's what is the terrain you're fighting on? What is the election about? And Trump has been very successful at moving our politics to this terrain where a large number of people in the country side with him.
And is there anything Kamala can do about that?
Yeah, I think what she can do is try to diffuse those issues. She's not going to win an election that's about the border. What she can try to do, as she has done, is try to kind of take that off the table by saying there was a solution to this. Trump killed it because he'd rather have the problem than the solution. He wants it hanging out there getting worse. And then try to move the election to abortion rights, economic fairness, all sorts of issues where she has the advantage. I think that one of the key lessons of 2016 is don't make the election all about Trump. Don't make the election all about the issues that Trump wants to talk about, because those issues are not winners for the Democratic nominee.
And how does she deal with the argument that she's been in office for the last, I mean, to my great shock, you didn't make this argument until the last 100 minute of the debate when everybody's going to the bathroom or getting a soda. But the argument that she's been in office for 3.5 years, and why did it take them 3.5 years to close the border?
That's
Or
one of his
partially close
strongest.
the border?
That's one of his strongest arguments. And there is an answer, which is we inherited a terrible crisis. The COVID response was completely botched by the Trump administration. They didn't have the capacity to do vaccinations. The economy was a mess, and they've had to do a lot of hard work to claw their way back. And so now the question, then you turn to, what is the choice for the next 4 years? But you're right, you have to deal with that. And even the best answer is not necessarily a winning answer. So, if Trump had just done what his advisors wanted, if he had stuck to the plan, we would be in a far different place today. If he had just brought everything back to the an inflation situation, the border and immigration, cost of living, and that sounds great, but why didn't you get it done over the last 3.5 years? He would have come out with the advantage. But the problem with Trump is, he's such a wounded, insecure person that, he cannot resist taking the bait. And part of the Harris team's strategy was to insert a little, Freudian bit of bait in almost every answer in hopes that he would get distracted and angry. And it worked. I mean, the other thing people aren't talking about as much, I mean, people are talking about how he constantly took the bait, but he was so hot on television. He was so angry, so full of rage and resentment. Maybe that's worked for him in the past. Traditionally, the more optimistic candidate wins presidential elections.
And what's that tradition based on, Brian? Because I keep reading that that is the tradition, and I'm trying to think. It certainly was true of Reagan and Carter when I started out. Reagan was a great optimist. He was the much more optimistic candidate than the gloom and doom Democrats. But tell me some more elections where that's worked.
Oh gosh, I think you go back to FDR, 1932. Happy days are here again in the midst of the Depression. He, in contrast, sort of dour Hoover, who said that we can't do very much. FDR was the great improviser and experimenter, and he was just going to try a bunch of stuff and see what worked. And he always had that great smile on his face and the jaunty kind of cigarette holder pointing upward. And I think that really resonated with a lot of people during a very dark time. Eisenhower was much more optimistic, read a lot happier than Adlai Stevenson, certainly JFK over Nixon. There are lots of examples of this. I mean, Reagan obviously was the great optimist, but it isn't just Reagan. I think that the best side of American character is, as one philosopher at Georgetown once said, that the core belief in the United States is that tomorrow can be better than today, and that each of us has the capacity to help make it so. Now that may be a little too rosy for the times in which we live, but I know that resonated deeply with Bill Clinton. He talked about that a lot. And, Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow was his theme song. And Harris is trying to do that in a way in this campaign by, her advertising is much more positive than negative. She's talking about what she's going to try to get done to lift the middle class over the next 4 years. She does have a fabulous smile that she is deploying in effect. But Susan, if I can break the format for 1 second and ask you a question as the leading expert probably on gender and politics and women who run for president, I've been curious kind of how you think about this big thing that we're not really talking about as much, which is she could become the first woman president, and how she's handling that in the campaign.
I think she's handling it brilliantly. She's not getting entrapped into identity politics, which brings up a lot of people's resentments. Everybody knows, or everybody who needs to know, that she's a woman. You see what's going on with the Swifties and the, pouring out of people on vote.gov and the other websites that register people to vote after the debate. And you know that something is changing, and she doesn't need to talk about it. She doesn't need to give Trump that satisfaction of playing to the sexist bone in many people's bodies. It wasn't so many years ago, Brian, that 30% of all Americans said their neighbors and friends wouldn't vote for a woman president, which tells me that 30% of the country wouldn't vote for a woman president. That's themselves they're talking about. So she's still got to deal with that brain, but she doesn't have to play to it. I think she's done it brilliantly. What do you think?
I think she has too. I keep thinking about something that Mandy Grunwald said, who was obviously one of Hillary Clinton's top advisors, both in 2008 and 2016, at the Harvard conference after the 2016 election, which was kind of a wild experience on many levels. But I remember some, bright undergraduate woman raised her hand at one of these panels and said, I don't think the problem was that Hillary was a woman. I think the problem is she was just the wrong woman. And Mandy kind of smiled, a sort of sad, bitter smile, and said, well, let me tell you a couple of things. Number one of the biggest problems women have had running for any executive office, let alone president, is people thinking they're not strong enough to lead. And everybody, even the people who didn't like Hillary, believed that she was tough enough to defend the country and to be commander in chief. And that's not so easy to replicate. I do think Kamala has achieved that over the course of this short campaign, with the speech she gave at the convention, with her performance in the debate, with the way that she's handled a lot of just the fact that she's been vice president, I think, has been very helpful. The second thing that Mandy Grunwald said is, um, the line that women have to walk is so tenuous. It's like a tightrope, because a little too far this way and they're too weak, a little too far that way and they're a bitch. And it's almost impossible to navigate that. And I think she has navigated that. And it's unfair, it's a double standard, but it's reality. I think she has handled it brilliantly. I also think deferring to Hillary at the convention to talk about the historical significance and not doing it herself was very smart.
I agree. I agree. And it brings me back to Geraldine Ferraro, who I did eons ago when she was running for vice president for the first time. And the coverage of her was so sexist that her being a woman was the operative factor. And it was very hard to ever get beyond that. And I think Kamala has gotten beyond that. What do you think going forward, Brian? What's your prediction, crystal ball for what the two sides will do and how Kamala and Trump will go forward in this? Will they debate again? Is that in anybody's best interest? I thought it was in Trump's best interest, not Kamala's, but I don't know. It played out the other way.
I don't know why he wouldn't want another debate. He's capable of a better performance than the one he gave. He's the one who's slightly behind. I mean, I guess you could argue it's tied, but if I were Trump's campaign, just looking at this from a purely sort of mercenary perspective, I would want to shake up the dynamic. I would know that I have powerful arguments that I wasn't able to make in the first debate. I would accept the challenge for a second debate. And I think, Harris's campaign wants a second debate because they feel confident now. They have great faith in their candidate to perform. And there's also a little bit of unfinished business on their side, too, around the economy and kind of making a crisper, clearer argument about her agenda and connecting it to people's lives. She began to do that in the first debate. I still think there's wood to chop there, and she could do that in a second debate. So I'm not at all convinced that we've heard the end of this. I think Trump could wake up tomorrow and decide he wants to do a debate, and then there would be a debate, and that would obviously be a sort of tectonic shift in this campaign. If there is not a debate, then this is just litigated through dueling events, through paid and earned media, and through what's going on in the world. Is there a deal between Israel and Hamas? Looks kind of unlikely now, but I know that the Biden administration is really determined to try to get that done before he leaves office. How does the economy look over the next several weeks? Do people actually start to feel better, if and when the Fed is widely expected to cut rates. When that happens, could that be a burst of positive thinking and optimism that marginally helps her? It's important to remember that we're not talking about the old days when 15, 20% of the public could move from one side or the other. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in an election in which 150 million Americans may vote. So, there's a tiny group of sort of persuadable voters. That's one piece of it, the sort of the swing voter side. And then the other piece of it is the mobilization side. Can Harris get more young people, more Black people, more Latinos who are supportive of her to vote? Can that share grow to be more reflective of their share in the population? And conversely, can Trump do what he did twice before and persuade some working class whites who would not normally vote to show up for him. If I were part of the Harris campaign, I'd be very nervous about relying too much on the polling, because in 16 and in 20, Trump substantially outperformed his polling. So, I think unless by we, I mean the Democrats, have a lead of at least 4 or 5 nationally going into election day, I'd be quite nervous.
Why does Trump outperform, Brian? Is it because people don't want to admit that they're for Trump and they just go into the ballot box and mark his name out of anger or sexism or racism or spite or desire or motives good and bad? I mean, what's going on there?
Well, there are a number of theories about the shy Trump voter. Some people say that, these are people who don't normally participate in politics, and therefore pollsters have a tougher time reaching them. Or part of it is the way that polling has become sort of discredited in certain segments of the right as part of the the media elite and the establishment that isn't for them, and therefore their response rate to polling is lower than people who are part of the Democratic coalition. The pollsters say that they found ways to at least partially correct for this by including a greater proportion of non-college whites. And indeed, the polling has gotten better since 2016. But Trump is, sui generis. He's a completely unique figure in our politics. And there are people out there who only come out to vote for him. There are also people who only come out to vote against him.
Right.
So we don't fully know the answer. I think there are many answers, but all of which is to say, if I'm the Harris campaign, I want to build in some cushion to account for that if I possibly can.
We possibly can. We're going to see her, I think, once more in California for a fundraising event at some point. But she's going to be spending all her time in what we call the swing states. How does that work? How does doing a rally in Philadelphia or a rally in Wilkes-Barre help her in Pennsylvania?
Well, she gets a lot of local news coverage. For all the decline we've seen in national news, network
Right.
news, local TV news is still a very powerful source of information for millions of people, especially for voters, because you got to remember voters are older than the population, and voters are more likely to watch television than the population, partly as a result of being older. So you go someplace, you get local coverage. You also get people registered. You get people who are volunteers who can talk to their friends who are less engaged in politics. The most compelling messenger in politics is somebody you already know, not a paid canvasser, but a kind of a relational organizer. That's the term that's used about somebody going to their social network and spreading messages that would be compelling. And part of it is just getting people out there to vote. And I think that's what Taylor Swift's doing. I'm not sure Taylor Swift is persuading Trump voters to switch to Harris.
Yeah.
I think what he's doing is getting young people who say, politics really isn't for me, actually to register and maybe to participate in the election. So you got to do all those things. I mean, that is the meat and potatoes of campaigning. You go to a place where there are a lot of voters you need, and you show up. And it isn't just big rallies. I mean, I think Harris has done very well, with what we call OTRs, little drop-bys in certain locations. She'll show up at a bakery, she'll show up at a grocery store, and she'll just schmooze with people. And she's very compelling in those circumstances. They take a video of it, they put it on social media, her supporters will share it, and it becomes a kind of a positive a moment that can be disseminated quite widely.
How is social media changing the way campaigns are covered today? You and I both go back. You're old enough to remember when everybody got their campaign news, or most people got their campaign news from the networks, from the regular networks, and then it was the news networks. And now it seems to be social media is the #1 source of campaign information for most people, and that's pretty astounding.
Well, there's a risk as you get older, and I find myself falling into this of being nostalgic for the old days. And I am a little bit nostalgic for the right wingers would call it the filter, but the editing function that the major newspapers, the broadcast networks played. And even though, as Pat Moynihan said, we were arguing about our opinions, we weren't arguing about our facts. We were all coming from the place of a sort of a shared truth, and then we would have different perspectives on it. Now everybody has their own facts, their own truth, and a lot of it is, to borrow a phrase, fake news. But people see it and they believe it. I think that's the biggest negative of social media. Is it's a place of affirmation more than information. It reinforces your existing worldview. Trump falls into this trap all the time. Half the stuff he shares, is a lie based on crap he's seen online that reinforces his perspective, like the Haitian immigrants eating dogs and cats. I mean, that like checks every box for Trumpism.
But didn't that hurt him? I mean, it seemed to me that he had a legitimate issue to take to Kamala Harris about the Biden administration's record on immigration, including, yes, that they finally got a bipartisan bill, but it was already 3.5 years into the administration before he took executive action. And yet the headline was all about the dogs and cats. It seemed to me that that was a failure of discipline on his part and an example of his bad judgment that actually cost him. Am I wrong?
I think net it hurt him. I think it reinforced the idea that he's chaotic and crazy. I think a lot of college educated suburbanites and others, professionals who were, long time Reagan, Bush, McCain, Romney voters have now become Democratic voters, at least at the presidential level, because of stuff like this. But might it whip up some of his people to show up, to turn out? Might they share this misinformation with their friends who are also horrified, and it reinforces their point of view? Yes, I think overall it hurt him more than it helped him. But I have rethought some of my priors since 2016, when Trump did a whole series of things, each of which would have been fatal to any other presidential candidate. January 6th should have been fatal to Donald Trump. The way he botched COVID should have been fatal to Donald Trump. But he manages to survive, because a lot of his supporters and people who don't normally vote think that this is a person who sort of stands up for their version, their vision of America. And so I don't think that killed him, but you're right. I think it hurt him.
It hurt the city, certainly.
Right. The Republican city, the Republican mayor, the Republican governor, all of whom are saying, essentially this is BS. And indeed, except for one tragic traffic accident, the experience of the Haitian Americans who are there legally has been very positive. They're in that city because the city needed more workers. And most of the response has been, these are very good workers. They're not on drugs. They show up on time. They go to church. Historically, of course, immigrants commit far fewer crimes than people who were born here. But he has whipped up this nativism that really is all about race, and that is the ugliest, darkest current through American politics. And Trump just grips it and won't let go.
And should Kamala ever take him on for it on racial grounds? I mean, we were talking earlier about how she doesn't run as the first woman president, and she doesn't make that part of her spiel. It's kind of obvious, but she's not playing to it or playing into it. What about Trump's racism? I mean, did you see, I'm sure you did, Donald Trump Jr.'s remark that Haitians have lower IQs than other immigrants?
Yeah, I did. And I mean, I don't know what basis there is for that, but it's based on hate and prejudice. I thought it was notable that in the debate, she did go farther than she had, over the course of this campaign, talking about Trump's really dark history with the Central Park Five, with denying African Americans the ability to rent one of his apartments, and he was sued for this. This goes back 50 years with Trump and his father having a kind of a early 1970s Queens kind of view of race and Black people in particular. And I'm glad she went farther, because honestly, the swing voters in this election are not just upscale white suburbanites. They're young men of color, Latinos, AAPI, and even some Black men. And I think communicating to them that Trump is a racist, that Trump thinks that people who are like them are, always guilty of every crime, never deserve the benefit of the doubt, have these characteristics that his son is willing to characterize in negative ways. I think that's helpful, and it's also, by the way, the right thing to do.
Right.
I also think, by the way, a lot of white people in this country have moved way past, the attitudes of their parents and grandparents on this stuff, and don't want to be associated with these views. I thought maybe the finest aspect of the unsuccessful McCain and Romney campaigns in 2008 and 2012 were the ways that both of those candidates refused to touch the sort of the racial issue, refused to play the race card. Our mutual friend Mike Murphy was in a meeting, I think, with Romney at one point, and a longtime Republican leader in Michigan said to him, well, you got to talk about immigration and crime in the city of Detroit. And, it was pretty clear what he was getting at. And Romney basically shut him down and said, that might work, but I would rather lose. And those guys, to their great credit, wouldn't go there. Trump does
They were
nothing.
different kinds of Republicans, weren't they?
Very much so. We need a responsible center-right party in America. Every presidential election cannot be an apocalyptic struggle for the future of democracy and the character of the American people, because Democrats aren't going to win every time. So I think what a lot of people, what the vast majority of the American people should be rooting for, is a Trump defeat. And maybe the lesson that the Republican Party takes is we need to go back to a kind of mainstream Republicanism. But I fear that it's going to take more than 2 defeats. It may take 3 or 4 defeats. How many? 3 Democratic defeats in the 80s before the Democratic Party reformed itself in the 90s. So we may be in for a continued bumpy ride.
Brian, it has been such a pleasure to be your fairy godmother and to watch you mature and age into this person with such a unique and well-rounded perspective on both politics and the media. And I hope you'll come back again as this campaign progresses.
Well, Susan, I'm totally the lucky one to be the beneficiary of your wisdom and generosity over all these years. And whenever you ask me to do anything, the answer is yes. So we'll
you're
talk.
A sweetheart. You've been listening to No Holding Back with me, Susan Estridge. I want to take this moment to thank Brian Goldsmith again for joining me today for such a candid and thought-provoking conversation. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch every episode over our own YouTube channel. Please leave a rating and review on your chosen platform. It really helps us reach more listeners and keep the conversation going. Follow us on X at No Holding Back FM, and for my weekly column, visit our website, estridgegolden.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on No Holding Back.